Hello everybody and welcome. Thank you for joining us today to demo Bedford Consulting's IFRS 16 application. My name is Samuel Ndebele and I'll be taking you through the demo so that you can see the app and understand a bit more about how it's helped the customers that we've worked with, and of course how it can help you at your organizations as well. Just sharing my screen here so that you can see the application. And as we open up here, we arrive on a landing dashboard in Anaplan. This is the model, this is the platform on which the application is built. And this is of course the application that we provide for IFRS 16. So here we have an overview, a navigation page, if you will, and we can run through here through each of the sections from 1 through to 5 so that you can see the various parts of the model and understand how they work through the IFRS 16 process. The focus here, of course, is around lease contracts and management of those lease contracts, moving through the calculations with the amendments to the disclosures and, of course, the journal exports. And we'll go through those in more detail as we move through. So to begin with, let's look at how we would upload or input the contract information. And if we come here through this contract management section, we'll skip these pieces here and go to 1.5. The earlier pieces here are actually just showing you how you would upload them manually if you were to upload one contract at a time. In most cases, you would want to be doing an upload, where we would do so here. We will look at managing contract details shortly, and of course status tracking as well. But in 1.5 is particularly good because it will also enable us to show the difference between uploads, and I'll take you through that so you see what I mean. We upload a CSV or text file, and we have some files here that I will be uploading the lease contract information. So I'll quickly select these, and it's a nice easy upload to pull that through. The upload is of course going to pull through contract information, lease contract information. But that information that it's pulling through will be relating to the lease contracts, but it will also be relating to the metadata that exists around those lease contracts. In Anaplan, we call these lists, and it's the basis of dimensionality. And we'll look at these in some of the later dashboards that we have. But the core thing to remember here is that it's a nice simple upload, and through that upload you can populate many different lists and data structures in addition to, but including, the lease contract information. So what this dashboard is showing us is any errors or changes or checks for those errors and changes. And we have a summary here that shows us that we've got 8 new countries, we've got 13 new contracts. We have a filter here so that we can see what they may be. And at the moment, this is effectively a holding place. So we haven't technically pulled this through into the data flow, into our workflow process. We've got it in this staging area before we choose to update that information. And we do of course want to update it. We do of course want to update it. So we'll update the metadata, the master data rather here, and push that through in terms of updating country and entity. So here we're updating those lists in the background. And you'll see that then the new countries have now cleared because of course they're now existing countries. And we have that data being pulled through. And the contract information that we have, of course, we also need to bring that through into the model. So we do so here, and then that flows through as well. Imports are nice and quick. We can see a validation showing us each of the stages or actions that have been completed. And now that data is in the system and ready for use. So very quickly, let's upload the next month of data so that we can see what it will look like in terms of showing us any changes. So of course, there will be potential amendments to a previous import. And there will also, of course, be new information for the new period that's being imported. And in this case, we can see that there are 2 new contracts, but we also have 3 contract changes. And those contract changes are highlighted in this section here. Within this section, we can see the change message showing us that it's a new end date that has been changed. And we can see that here in terms of the new end date that has happened. We have a new lease amount, and we can see what that new lease amount is. There's also, of course, a new service fee, the new interest percentage, and so on. Early termination has been ticked on this specific contract where it wasn't ticked beforehand. So these updates are the updates that we gain so that we can track any changes that are happening. We can then run through each of the processes to ensure that everything is updated in the way that we want it to. We push it through the system, and then we're now holding all of this data in Anaplan, and it's now available for use. So now that we're done with our upload, next we want to look at those contract details. Okay, so we move into our contract details section, and we can see that here in terms of managing those contract details. And the key thing in here is understanding that there are many changes that we will want to make to the contract input. We will, of course, have imported the core information from our source system. So with that contract upload, we would expect that certain bits will be populated. But what we're able to do in this model, in this application, is make the amendments that we need to make so that we can customize or adjust those contract inputs to ensure that we're getting the best out of that calculation and seeing what we want to see in the disclosures and journals at the end. And here we have our right of use asset settings. We can see the lease liability, and we also have the option to input our payments on or before commencement date, the initial direct cost, estimated cost of dismantling or restoring the asset, or any other that we may want to bring in. And of course, we can choose between all of the contracts that we have. This list is a list that we have imported, so we've updated this effectively automatically from that import, but of course we can amend these or build these manually as well. So we can build them either from an import or from that manual process as well, depending on which you prefer. And we can look at all of those and choose them as we want to as well. And you'll see that everything in here, of course, will synchronize accordingly. We have our depreciation settings. And again, where we see something being blue, we know that we can input against that. So we have a drop down here in terms of whether there'll be a transfer title of ownership. And we can make all of these selections. We can see the lease term in months here, and of course the depreciation term. We have additional info in terms of the entity, the lease currency, start and end month, and of course the lease category as well. Moving down the page, we've got our contract duration settings. So again, we're always looking by a specific contract, and we can see our start date and the standard end date. Of course, we have a preferred option for end date as well, in terms of whether it be standard, prolonged, purchase date, early termination, or other. This in green here is green to show us that it will be affected by the selection that we make up here. So it's showing us through that color coding or conditional formatting the areas that we need to focus on and the areas that should self-populate from the import. So the goal here, of course, is that it's easy to use and user-friendly, so that it's nice and intuitive in terms of getting the data in and using it in the way that you need to. Contractual bindings, not too much to change in here, but of course we do have a selection here, a Boolean selection tick box in terms of defining whether it's an open-end contract. And then we have our payment settings over here with a few inputs in terms of override lease components, payment methods, and so on. On the payment methods, we can choose whether it be in advance or arrears. The payment setting input, we can choose whether that be monthly, quarterly, half yearly, yearly, or custom. And we'll play with these a little bit as we move through so that you can see the different options and the outcomes of those. Rent-free periods in months, we can choose the months in terms of that input. We have a periodic increase that we can input, and of course the periodic increase month, so we can set that accordingly as well. We have a payment schedule here, and in this payment schedule we can then put in anything that we require in terms of custom payments and custom service fees. And again, that of course is by contract. Everything that we have in this model is going to be by that lowest level of granularity, which of course is going to be by contract and then we can see that rolling up through the organizational hierarchy as we've defined. Coming to the bottom of this page, we have our discount details. We have an option for that discount to be set by entity. So we can have a sort of top-down approach where we would set the discount by entity, and then for all contracts that are effectively children of that entity or roll up into that entity, they would have the entity's discount rate. Or alternatively, we can of course set that discount rate by contract, which is what we have done in this case, because it's been part of the input or the import in this case. There is of course the option to override that discount rate percentage, so that again by contract we can put in an override where we need to. We can change the changes during the contract, so we can look at the we can activate the change here with this tick box. We have a new end date option, so that we can amend that as we need to in terms of prolongation options, early termination, other, and so on. And down here we have this contract workflow. Now the contract workflow is utilizing some of the functionality that Anaplan has in terms of control, if you like. So by ticking this confirm and by selecting who has confirmed it, so in this case of course me, and it's showing my email address, then what would happen is it would now lock down effectively to say that my submission is complete. So I'll be able to push this through. Maybe I've input this manually, this specific contract, this contract that I'm owning. And because I've now locked this down, it would then show in that workflow that I've completed my submission. And then that would then be released by the next person up in the chain in terms of approval. So a way of controlling or centrally controlling those submissions, but doing so, of course, within the app. You can create new modified payment schedules and open custom payment schedule modifications as well. And down here, we have a contract type, and this is in relation to IAS 17. And what this enables us to do is to determine whether this is a financial or operational lease. Of course, IFRS 16 relates to operational leases. So by making this selection, we'll see later on a comparison dashboard that will enable us to see the differences in terms of the impact of following IFRS 16 instead of IAS 17. So as we move through now, we sort of set our parameters as we have done in here. We've looked at our payment schedule in terms of whether it be monthly or custom, and we now want to look at the entity settings. And the entity settings we have down here in this section 4, in this settings section. And as we were saying, we have our lists in Anaplan, which are the basis of dimensionality. And one of those lists in this case is, of course, entities. And the entities is a parent or a roll-up of the contract. And within here, we're able to then set the entity currency, most importantly, in this section. And then, of course, a mapping table as well. In here, we just have example 1 and example 2. But on that concept of lists, we could have anything in here that we would want that would relate to your organization in terms of that which you may want to map that entity to, or that currency to, or whatever else you may want to do in there, with of course a code for identification of those entities. We look here at application settings. So here we're now starting to set the parameters, or define the key metrics, if you like, within the calculations that we have in the back end. And initially we look at our group currency. So we've looked at our entity currency. We're now looking at that group currency, and that's going to be key for us for our reporting later on in our disclosures. We look at our transition method, and the choices that we have here are full retrospective, modified retrospective, equal ROU and LIA, and of course modified retrospective equity impact. And again, we will flick through these and see the impacts that we have, or the changes in impact in the disclosures later on. Transition date input, really key, 1st of the 1st, 2019. Of course, for IFRS 16, this is the date that applies, but we have that option to change this as and when you would need to. And then the calculation method in terms of whether it be compounded monthly or simple, and you'll be able to choose through those. So that you can either be reckoning to what you previously had in your Excel model, or of course just because you wanted to compare the two. Finally, here we include pending contracts in journals and reports, and you have the choice to do this or not. Time settings, we have our time running down here on rows, and we have the selections that run across on columns, select months to lock. So what we're really looking at here is whether you wanted to lock certain periods, whether you wanted to lock certain time frames, and then of course whether you wanted to reopen those. And you would confirm that reopen by putting through as a yes. And we can combine this with workflow, of course. So, you can set this by user and so on, as with all of the other features in the application. As we look at our settings, we want to look at our FX rates. And within here again, we see that some are blue and we see that some are black. So for those which are blue, we can input, and for those which are black, we can't input because it's going to be based on a calculation or a logic that is underlying. As we look at dimension, we can see that we have our currencies on rows. Up here we have a list of versions, and in this case we're of course looking at actuals. And then we have a list of time, and we can see here that we're running from FY05 all the way through to FY63 with all of the months in between. So looking now at Jan 19, we can see the average and ending for the rate roll forward, and of course also the rate input. So we can amend those as we need to, moving through, and see the group currency that applies. Let's look at the calculation. So one of the key benefits of this model, of this app, is that the calculation logic is pre-built, which enables you to have a plug-and-play solution where your focus can be on simply inputting data via an upload from a trusted source, setting the parameters that you want, as we have been looking at in terms of our contract management and our contract details. The calculation will happen in the back end, and then of course we have our outputs. And here we have a summary of that calculation, and it gives us a walk, if you like, from opening balance to closing balance for assets and liabilities, and shows us ultimately what's happening in the background and what's going to be driving those disclosures at the end. So again, in terms of dimensionality, we have our time running through here. We can see our months, and we also have the period number that applies. Initially looking at assets, we see our opening balance. We can see an option for asset correction, impairment, and of course depreciation, this giving us a closing balance. On the liability side, we can see the opening balance. The liability has been split between current and non-current, and we see that breakdown here. We then have our liability correction, service fee, lease payment, IBR percentage, interest payment, and then of course all of that feeding the total payments. We've got the payments cumulative, all resulting in a closing balance. That closing balance is of course split between current and non-current as per the opening balance. So a nice clear walk from opening to closing balance with the liability split between current and non-current. And we can see up here some key information in terms of the status and country, entity, lease currency, and any other metadata that would be key to you, of course, can be added as need be. Most importantly, up here, we're able to choose the contract that we want to view, and that, of course, will synchronize through the model. If we just take a quick look here at total payments, we have the option to drill down into total payments so that we can see it in more detail. So what we see here is that if we look at the source of what we just clicked on, we have that total payments within this contract. It shows us that total payment is a breakdown of lease payment and service fee, but we can see that it's the lease payment that of course is holding the value. And then up here it shows us the logic behind that lease payment, and it's saying that it of course is lease payment plus service fee. So we get to take it down to its lowest level of granularity in terms of understanding what that does. This formula is a kind of formula that you will see in Anaplan regularly. The key thing here is that there's no coding. So the logic of how a calculation is built, this calculation that I say is in the back end, is a calculation that is built in a language that you will understand. You don't need to be a developer or a programmer to build models like this in Anaplan. You just simply need to understand what you want to do, and it pretty much works its way that you can click and drag and drop to build that logic in. The functions that we have available in Anaplan are available in a community space called Anapedia that will become available to you as an Anaplan customer at no extra charge, of course. And within here, we have a series of functions, and they're grouped by time and date functions, financial functions, numeric, and so on. If we just look at all of the functions, we have them all here alphabetized, and we can go through to something like sum, which of course is nice and familiar. And we have a description of what that is, how it works and what it's doing, syntax that will be accepted in Anaplan, the format of inputs and outputs, arguments, constraints, and of course an Excel equivalent. The understanding being that many people are moving from an Excel environment into an Anaplan environment. So that transition has been made nice and easy by providing the Excel equivalent where applicable. It even goes to the extent of accepting the Excel syntax for a sum if in Anaplan, but of course it will translate it to the Anaplan syntax. But it sort of tries to cover all stops in terms of making that a seamless transition in your progression from Excel to Anaplan. We have the option to pivot, and this is an option that we have in all dashboards on all modules. For example, we may want to see the contracts on rows. So we would now look at a specific period, and here we have the choice of periods. So we can see that we can choose whichever period it is that we may want. We'll look at Jan 16, for example, and then we can see all of our contracts running through here. So it might be that actually we only want to see a certain selection, so we can choose to show just that selection, and maybe we only want to see the closing balances. So again, we can move through and position it in such a way that we can just look at the closing balances, like so. So we have that flexibility to move around and manipulate the dashboards as we see fit. Let's take a little look at reporting. We have a monthly reporting dashboard here that nicely shows us some visual representation through charts and so on, showing us the figures that we have. And again, as with everything else, it is interactive. So we always have that choice of how we structure it in terms of that which we show. We can move through the contracts. So if we take up here, for example, and we look at a different contract, of course, everything will synchronize and show us. All interactive. And we always have the option, of course, to maximize, like so. And we can move through each of the sections as we want to. Naturally, we can export these to a PDF. We can link Anaplan with Excel through the Excel add-in, and we can also link Anaplan with PowerPoint through the PowerPoint add-in. And in those situations, you would effectively log into Anaplan through the Microsoft application, so through PowerPoint or through Excel. You would create or establish a link based on selecting the source in Anaplan. And then from the PowerPoint or Excel application, you'll be able to just hit refresh and update your data, knowing that it's true to source. Down here, we have a lease plus interest breakdown, so we can see the lease payments, interest payment, the service fee, and of course, the total payments. And we're looking at those by period. Finally, down here, we've got a payments chart, which again gives us some visual representation of the underlying data. This, of course, being a monthly report, there is also a yearly report showing very similar in terms of the charts, just giving us that visual representation. Moving on to disclosures. Naturally, this is really key because this is sort of where it all comes together, if you like. And in terms of dimensions, we have our periods to choose from here. So we can see that we're looking at Jan 19, but we have those same periods from before. We have our contracts here as a selection. And now we also have currency as a selection. So based on the settings that we've made beforehand, we can now choose to see the data in lease currency, entity currency, or group currency. The entity currency, as we can see, is in euros. So if we were to choose entity currency, we'll be seeing that in euros. If we were to choose group currency, We'll be seeing that in pounds. And of course, this is based on what we can see here. The rates that are being used are based on the rates that we set in our settings. So of course, we're able to go through and make those changes, and we can do so by month so that we're keeping it as detailed as it can be. Within here, we can see a breakdown here of category, of lease category. And most importantly, this walk, as we move through rows, is taking us from opening balance to closing balance in terms of right of use. And then, of course, the liability opening to closing. And looking through here, what we can see is a transition impact. And then we can see the movement impact here. And we can see that that movement impact is a result of the amortization rather, and depreciation. If we want to look at the changing these, so earlier on we were looking at the kind of changes that we might make, and we can do that in here. If we go into our application settings, we have some choices here, and this is going to affect the impact in the disclosure. So looking at our transition method and looking at our disclosure, when we start to look at these impacts, if we start to make changes here, so if we put it on full retrospective, for example, we will see that the changes that will happen in the outputs will occur because of the way the calculation is driving in the background. So if I were to, bear with me, so looking at the walk from opening balance, right of use, through to closing balance, and then looking at the opening balance here through to closing balance, if we see our impact in terms of movement impact here and movement impact here, we'll see those changes apply as we make those changes on the transition method. And as we move further down the page, we can see the EBITDA impact. If we move to one that has data in it, and we can see the lease expense, the service expense, and the total for IAS 17, and then we can see that in relation to IFRS 16, and of course the difference, if there is one, that applies here. And again, we can make those adjustments from here in terms of how we would want that to be seen, or how we'd want that calculation to work. You'll see these changing up here as we make that change. Okay. From our disclosures, we want to be seeing this in journal form. And what we can see here is firstly a selection of time period. So we can choose the years that are relevant to us. And we're seeing January to December of FY19 on the basis that we have chosen FY19. If we choose different years, of course, this filter will change as well. And again, we're able to view based on currency. So we can choose our lease, our entity, or our group currency. The refresh selected years is applying to the filter, and we have any messages up here so that we can communicate with the end user based on that which we want them to see. In this situation, we can see the right of use opening through recalculation, the liability opening current, and of course that going all the way through to recalculation of non-current and then retained earnings. All of the information that we're seeing here at this disclosure stage is being affected by the parameters that we are setting at the earlier stages. So when we look at our overview and we look at our entity settings in terms of, for example, currencies, when we look at the FX rate settings, and when we look at the application settings in terms of transition methods, these are the selections that will drive the outputs in the disclosure and also, of course, therefore in the journals. So once we've had an overview of our journals, we now need to consider exporting those journals for upload. outside of Anaplan. And in doing so, we may well have different mappings that are required based on the identification of data in the target system from the source system, in this case, the source system, of course, being Anaplan. So what we'd now be able to do is to say, based on this, for example, example 1, example 2, we would be able to come through and set our mappings so that we can say that building in the target is recognized as 239823. Of course, in Anaplan, it's going to be recognized as building in relation to right of use opening. And we can go through here and set each of these mappings as we would want to, so that we now have a secure and robust way of exporting those journals from Anaplan to Excel. And to show you exactly how that will work, when we want to export those journals, we would see them like so. And we can now see the entity based on the code. We can see the cost center. In this case, it's not applicable. The contract, although slightly hidden here, it is in there. Like so. We've got the account, we've got the amount month to date, and the amount year to date. It's set up to be nice and easy for us to just export that into Excel, which we can do just by clicking the button. And then we can open that in Excel to take a quick look and see what that looks like before uploading it as we need to outside of Excel into our system. So we see here that we've got February 19. We can see each of the accounts. We can see the entity and all of the other information that we have in here. So as a quick overview of what we have covered, it all begins with an import of contract information, the lease contract being brought into the system, and we do so via an upload or via the manual method. We can see the differences in uploads, and they're shown nice and clearly to us through this section in 1.5. We then have our core settings in terms of our entity settings, in terms of our application settings and our FX rates. We also have our CPI index settings, so we can input those as we need to. And of course, we can update these lists to reflect the lists that are relevant to your business as well. This, of course, being by month. We have our data management section, where we start to look at those calculations, the payment schedules. We can look at our incremental borrowing rates, our IBR, and also any modifications that we require as well. We have a contract status tracking section so that we can see the workflow and we can understand where a contract is in that process in terms of whether it's confirmed, whether it's submitted, when it's happened, and so on. Have an update here that this one, of course, is waiting for confirmation, and we can see that graphically as well. From the settings that we have made, we would go through our reporting. We would be able to see our monthly and yearly reporting, a contract overview so that we can see everything as a summary, and of course the comparison that we'll be looking at IFRS 16 in relation to IAS 17. So for those settings that we were making earlier on, when we were saying whether the contract type would be financial or whether that contract type would be operational, we can start to see that impact. So here we're looking from an IAS 17 perspective in terms of the calculations. And as per before, we're seeing the asset opening balance through to closing balance. And that's taking into account the impairment and depreciation. So we can see that that opening balance is, of course, reducing, in this case, by depreciation to give us that closing balance. And then we can see on the liability side, again, the opening balance with a correction, moving through lease payment, service fee, the IBR percentage, interest payment, giving us our total payments. We can see that as a cumulative, and of course this gives us our closing balance. So we can see that from the perspective of IAS 17, and then of course our new perspective in terms of IFRS 16, where we see the same walkthrough. And at the bottom, we can then see if there are any differences. Okay. Now the selection up here, of course, being on financial, means that there won't be any differences because IFRS 16, of course, doesn't apply to the financial leases. But if we were to change it to operational, then we would see that it would now apply in the way that was relevant. If we move here to a different lease, we would see the information would change accordingly. We select it as an operational lease, and of course then it would move through and show us any differences that we wanted to see. So some other points to note. Typically, the implementation of this app is approximately 10 days. Of course, there is variation based on specific requirements from a customer, but generally speaking, up to 10 days is the norm. And we would begin with a POC and scoping, and then of course go straight into that implementation with one of our consultants. And it's a pretty streamlined and simple process in the sense that the app is doing the heavy lifting, and we're really looking to configure what you currently have in terms of data and structure, your contract leases and the metadata around them in with Anaplan, so that of course you can bring that in a seamless manner through the upload that we have, and then of course seeing those disclosures and your journals in terms of exports. So if there are any queries, any questions or follow-ups, of course, please do get in touch, and the email address will be provided. Thank you very much for your time today, and I look forward to hearing from you all soon.